Welcome to the first monthly recap for Goblin's Greed. If you're new around here, I'm Sporcer, and a little over 30 days ago, I was part of a mass layoff at a company I was at for 7 years. I decided to turn the situation into an opportunity and finally pursue my dream of being a full-time game developer. A little background about me is I was a professional software engineer before being laid off, and I've worked in various game engines as a hobby for 15 years, and I've competed in a few game jams. With that out of the way, let me share with you the progress so far on Goblin's Greed. Week 1 mainly consisted of modeling the goblin and getting some default animations retargeted onto him because, as you can tell, the ones that I made are just about as bad as they could be. Retargeting animations is actually where I had my first roadblock. I started the project on Unreal Engine 5.6, which apparently has a bugged retargeting system. When attempting to retarget the animation on your chosen skeleton, it would shoot your model into the air and the scale would be off. I sunk a lot of time into trying to figure out what the issue was, but once I transitioned the project to Unreal Engine 5.5, I've had no issues. The second week had two standout objectives, the first being my modular dungeon walls. This was tricky for me as I had never done something like this, and designing these with modularity in mind was definitely a challenge, but they came out looking great and fit together like Lego pieces. The second big win of week 2 was our boy, the gelatinous cube, and his roam functionality. We love seeing our boy sludging through the dungeon. To achieve this sludging functionality, I dove into enemy AI and behavior trees, which were new to me. Right now, the behavior tree isn't too complicated. It simply uses my custom Blackboard task, roam, until it sees a player, in which case it will follow the player. When it loses sight of a player, it will move to the last known location of that player. The Blackboard task roam simply gets a random point in the nav mesh and the enemy proceeds to that location. Previously, I was using get random location in navigable radius, but changed it to this get random reachable point in radius, as this ensures the enemy should be able to move there. Sometimes the nav mesh will appear on top of walls and other things that the enemy wouldn't be able to successfully reach, and this method should avoid that. The sight mechanic utilizes Unreal Engine's AI perception component, and I set up an AI sense sight and provided values to control its vision cone. And I use the on target perception updated event to call handle sight sense. What this does is first check that the current stimulus received is AI sense sight. This is because you can handle multiple senses like sound, which I am planning as well, and this function is solely dedicated to sight. It then checks if stimulus successfully received, which is basically saying, do I see the player or not? If it sees the player, it checks if the target actor is currently valid, which is simply, do I already have a target? This was implemented so that as long as the cube has a target, it will be locked onto that player. If the cube loses sight, it then sets the target actor to null, checks everything in its vision cone for a new target, and follows that, or if no target was found, it proceeds to the last known location. Week 3 is when I began implementing traps and the interact system. The interact system got refactored during week 4, so I'll talk on that in a bit. For the beginning traps, I made a swinging hammer and a projectile wall. Traps are obviously designed to impede the player, but they can be disabled by interacting with a specific mechanism. Neither are very complicated, but very briefly, the hammer checks if it's triggered and will play a timeline on repeat if so. The timeline also provides a faux velocity calculation. I use these peaks to know which direction the hammer is swinging, and I can launch the player using this value. Currently, the timeline only allows to swing in one direction, which I need to change. And when it's disabled, it stops abruptly, so I need it to come to a rest. The arrow wall is super basic, it simply spawns projectiles when triggered. The fire code absolutely needs to be refactored. At the time, I was having issues getting the projectiles to stagger, which resulted in this very pristine code. The biggest challenge with the traps was the disable trigger with the procedural spawning. Since I wanted control over where the traps and disable box are placed in the dungeon rooms, I created a disabler blueprint that simply calls a disabled event when interacted with that the traps listen to. Inside the dungeon rooms, I place scene components under the trap trigger parent and I give them a tag. The same for the trap disabler minus the tag. So when the rooms are done spawning, they each call engage traps, which checks if there are any traps in the room, binds them to the disabled trap event, and spawns the correct trap based on the tag. Week 4 was solely focused on getting all previous functionality with proper replicated netcode. To continue on the topic of my interact system, let's take a look under the hood and see how it's working. I have two run-on-server RPCs, an interact start and an interact end. When interact started is called, it gets all overlapping actors that overlap the player's interact range that you can see here. It then checks if that actor implements the interactable interface, which looks like this. It has 3 functions. The first, interact, is where each specific actor that can be interacted with will place its specific code to run once interacted with. For example, if you interact with a door, you want it to open, but if you interact with an item, you want to pick it up. The second is requires hold. This simply returns true or false on whether or not the player needs to hold the button down to interact with it. And the last is get hold duration, which returns how long the player must hold the button down. Back into the RPC call, it checks if holding is required, and if not, it simply calls interact on the actor and breaks from the loop. If a hold is required, it caches the current interactable item, gets the hold duration, and sets a timer by function, so when the timer is reached, it then calls interact on the cached actor. I also use a timeline to control the current interact progress for the visual UI feedback. Interact end is called when the action is cancelled or completed, and it clears the function timer, clears the cached interactable, and stops the timeline. During this week, I also created the foundation for weapons, as well as an equipment manager component to handle the equipping of items. To do this, I am using Unreal Engine's gameplay ability system, as it does a lot of heavy lifting, especially where replication is concerned. For the weapons, I structured them so that I only need one blueprint that I then feed a weapon data asset into, which holds all the concerning data like the weapon's attributes, abilities, visual mesh, and the like. I really like this data-driven approach. The equipment manager component currently only handles weapons, but it simply handles the spawning the correct weapon, attaching it, and setting the correct animation blueprint for that weapon, which all gets called from the gameplay ability, which is triggered by a gameplay tag where I pass in a payload that indicates which weapon to equip. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is the dungeon generation system. I worked on it throughout multiple weeks, and it is the MVC of the month, and I wanted to dedicate some time to showcasing it. Look at this bad boy zoomed out. I don't think I've ever mentioned it, but you have probably all noticed a color coding among my blueprints, so I'll touch on that briefly. I use green to tell myself this is working how I want it and don't want to change it. Yellow is this is incomplete or needs to be fine-tuned, and red is this absolutely is not here to stay. It's just a little bit of mental organizing I use when working on stuff. I use a very similar convention for my folders. Anything red I know I have to delete, so when I go to do that, anything still being referenced will show up, indicating I still have things needing replaced. The other colors I use have less meaning, but I try to color code folders I come back to a lot. Obviously, the Goblin folder is green. Okay, back to the dungeon generator. The generator takes in a dungeon layout where I can specify all sorts of things, like a name, a weight to affect how likely it is to get picked, how many rooms per floor I want, how many floors I want, any required rooms that I want to spawn 100%. The rooms can also be controlled via their data structure. Things like max usage, what floors they're allowed on, and how many rooms need to spawn before these rooms can spawn. And this is ingested in the dungeon generator right here. Based on all the specs I just went over, it returns valid tiles to choose from and chooses one at random using the weights for each room. It then spawns the room and sets its location and rotation, and checks if it's overlapping any other rooms, which we can't have. And if it does, we just try again. It does this until the floor is completed, where it will then check if all required rooms for the floor were spawned, and if not, it forcibly spawns them. If all floors are spawned, then dungeon complete is called. You'll notice I still have some yellow in this code. Currently, floor complete doesn't do anything if it returns false when checking the failsafes, basically meaning if the floor wasn't able to spawn correctly given the requirements. It checks them correctly, it just doesn't handle it yet. The other yellow is in spawn enemies. Sometimes the enemy will spawn outside a room and fall to its death. I believe this is because of the starting rooms that spawn, and I just haven't gotten to it yet. Alright, that will wrap up this monthly recap. When I started this, I wasn't necessarily expecting to do these long form videos, so if there's anything specific you'd like to see more of, or something in general, please let me know. And if this is your first time finding me, I post daily devlog shorts, so if that interests you, please keep an eye out for those. And with that, I am out, and I will see you next time.